Good morning. Welcome back to another episode of the Red Chip Poker Podcast. I'm your host, James Splitsuit Sweeney, joined as always by Chris Warren. Chris, how you doing today?
I'm doing very well. Having a good time. How are you doing?
I cannot complain in the slightest. It's another day in paradise down here in Mississippi. Today, though, I want to talk about GTO. And I know we've been talking a lot about GTO this season. I think it's incredibly important. And really, we're trying to take GTO and make it a little bit more usable, a little bit more understandable, break it down. Accessible, exactly. And it's such a scary concept at first. But today I want to talk about why it's important and why people should more heavily consider putting this into their game. And breaking that down kind of from some bigger picture point of views. So you and I were talking off mic before we started here, and you were talking about an example of football and how that relates to GTO and how you were tying that back to poker. So start with that example, and we're just kind of start the conversation there.
Yeah, so the Super Bowl was last night, which had me thinking, and we were chatting in Discord about, I think a common question that we get, which is just like, okay, well, like, why should I be making a GTO-oriented play, which plays my entire range, versus just trying to play my specific hand the highest EV I can? And having watched the Super Bowl, I thought of an analogy that was basically like, well, in football, you have two types of plays. You have a pass play and you have a run play. And there's a third type of play, which is I would call a branch in the strategy that we use in poker. That's called a play action, which is essentially a fake run into a pass. And this is American football for all our non-American friends. I lived in South America. I know they get very insistent about that. So we are talking about American football. But anyways, like one of the things that happens with these fake runs is that they end up being some of the biggest plays in football. There's like a lot of deceptive value. It's, the defense will overcommit, and then boom, you get a big pass play that ends up in getting points and touchdowns and things like that. So why is this so effective? Well, it's because basically you are getting someone to optimize their defensive strategy in football, the literal defense, around defending a certain type of play, when in actuality you're doing a different type of play. However, the cost on doing the faking, essentially you have to make it look plausible, and it has to be a situation where it's plausible. There's a cost to it, that like you're essentially running a less efficient pass play, right? It'll take longer for your people to get out there. There's a higher probability that the quarterback will be pressured into making a bad play, etc. And this is pretty much all directly analogous into poker, where we have bluff raises and we have check raises and all these sort of sophisticated plays that we make a small percentage of the time. And most of the time we make those plays, we're just raising for value, right? It's like, oh, we got someone to c-bet on the flop, and now we want to start playing a big pot with our very strong hands. Or, we called on the flop, we raised the turn, we just raised the flop, whatever, we raised the river we got there. All these times when we want to value raise, we also want to have these bluffs. And these bluffs are, I think, just a perfect analogy to a play action in football, where that bluff is less efficient. Because if you think about it, like if I'm making a bluff raise on the river, most of the time I'm risking more than the size of the pot to win this pot with a hand that doesn't have any chance of winning, right? And so that's a highly inefficient play in general. And so I just think that analogy there's that direct connection in terms of like understanding conceptually why we sometimes make inefficient looking plays, that the deceptive value even has mathematically provable strategic value.
I think that's a really, really good analogy and way of visualizing it. I can see some people kind of hearing this and being like, okay, but I know my opponent and I know that I don't need to have any bluffs in here, right? They're fishy. They're going to call too darn much. So I can just jam the river with all of my value, get tons and tons of value. And why bother throwing a bluff in there? And for the person who's thinking that, and I know there's more than a few that are thinking that right this moment, how do you respond to them? Like, how do you convince that person that no, like having a bluff in here is good, does make sense, is good strategically speaking, not just I could lose a big pot, so don't do it, which I think is kind of baked into it.
Yeah, and I think this is actually most people's objections when they start encountering GTO, often in the context of a single hand. So let's just say this: if we are all to go out there and just play one single hand, this is frequently fine, right? It's like if you can figure out with certainty, with a high degree of certainty, that there's a higher EV in making a certain play that one time, great. Like, actually, no argument for me. Go ahead, do that. Take your highest EV. Understand that a lot of times in poker, you will be giving away information when you make that play. For example, when I sit down in a live game and everyone limps to me on the button, and then I just bomb it for 10x the blind or whatever, and everyone folds, like the suspicions levels will go up the next time I do that, is what I've noticed having done this play many times. And in fact, I almost think about when I sit down in a live game, I have like a bank of unknown players who don't know that I might make plays like that or something. And I almost think about it like I visualize it as I have maybe a couple like check marks, like, oh, I can do it once. Second time, maybe now they're a little suspicious. And then the third time, it's like no one's going to be giving me much credibility at that point. So I have to plan accordingly. And bullets in the chamber, let's say. Yeah, that's the way I think about it. So I choose my bluffs, and I try and choose situations that I think will give me the highest EV. So if I think it's really thin, then I might steer away from one early on and try and save that bullet in the chamber for a more lucrative situation where I could get some credit and take a bigger pot. So so like we really don't have any objection if you just know your situation and you have a high confidence. However, many people, I think, over optimize around the fact that they can totally know their opponent's strategy. This is the most common thing. James and I are extremely experienced, talented players, and for most decisions in poker, I would say I do not have a high confidence on exactly what my opponents will be doing. I'm trying to pick a blend or an average or something like that. And when you're in this situation, in my opinion, GTO tends to add a level of defensibility to your play that actually reduces the amount of certainty that you need against your opponents. It reduces the just peg someone on a hand and know exactly what they're doing, peg them on a range, know exactly what they're doing. It actually protects you. It's easier. It is a more complicated strategy. Yes, sometimes, oftentimes. But if you're able to sort of handle your side of it, what actually happens for your opponent is that you've created an exponentially more complicated defense of your new sophisticated strategy. And so for me, that's why I love having those check raises in my range. Even though it's a small percentage, that's why I love having those raises, is because I know as people are watching what I'm doing and trying to catch on and things like that, people will have ideas about what I do, and they will start to figure out some aspects of my game. And if there's just a percentage branch in there that they can't ever quantify, if that's just exists in there, the amount of mistakes they may make trying to optimize around my strategy when my strategy is balanced oftentimes can generate even more profits. So that's really the pitch.
Yeah. So point of clarification, because when people hear frequencies and throwing in some frequency, I think there's always a question mark of, are we talking about a frequency in terms of an action or a frequency in terms of density of bluffs? So can you kind of discuss that just a little bit, just to kind of clarify this point? Because I can hear some people being like, okay, which frequency, what thing am I really focused on here?
Yeah. So that is the right question. And I think that is kind of the challenge of these GTO strategies, is that, like, how exactly do you do something at a certain frequency? And so let's take, we actually had a great example that we went over in a blind versus blind pot. I think it was on the poker bank, where we had king 10 suited in the big blind, small blind raised, we called. And the flop comes 10 high, and we also have the flush draw. So this is a situation we got bet into. And basically we talked about how often should we raise this flop, with top pair and a flush draw. That is what I would say is like the sophisticated small percentage play that makes playing against you really difficult, right? And the reason about that is if you start thinking about what are the branches of raising top pair and a flush draw on the flop. Well, number one, okay, we raise, they shove, whatever. I mean, we're not folding. They may be shoving draws, whatever. Maybe we just have sufficient equity against an overpair. Who knows? Like, it's the type of hand that we raise and we just would never fold on the flop. So we call. That creates challenges for our opponents, right? Because if they were to shove draws, well, now we're actually way ahead of any draw in that scenario with the top pair. And, it's like it puts them in uncomfortable situations with top pairs or say over pairs or just maybe other top pairs that maybe we beat in that situation where it's like, well, I shouldn't be raising top pair or folding top pair to a raise. But then if I'm able to raise so thinly for value against their top pair, that gets really scary. So you're kind of starting to see like, wow, there's all these nice complex branches that our opponent has to deal with. Now we have to figure out, okay, do I raise king 10 suited, queen 10 suited, jack 10 suited, 10 9 suited? Am I raising all of these? Am I, how many of these? Like, are the top kickers raised more or whatever? And the thing I would say is that, like, again, we have a GTO plus post flop solve that we can go look at after the fact. In the moment, you don't have that. And the reality of the situation is, you probably won't know on this exact flop texture, et cetera, what the percentage is going to be. So to start, let's just say if anytime you want to make a small percentage play, you're trying to figure out, well, first of all, we know it's probably less than 40%, right? Small percentage, just by definition.
Yep.
So number two, we have two really key variables that we look at every time we're kind of analyzing flops in situations like this. Number one is nut advantage, and number two is range advantage. And I think that's something that almost everyone playing small stakes poker overlooks, is that you can actually get a sense of how strong your range is on the board versus your opponent's range with, kind of the obvious hand, right? Like, obviously we don't necessarily know what our opponents are playing in any given situation with like, 7-4 suited. Are they playing exactly that combo? I mean, we can only speculate. But when they're raising the small blind in the button, we can probably say they have 100% aces, right? We can probably say they have 100% tens on our 10-3-4 flop or whatever. We could probably say in an online game, we could probably give people credit for having pretty much all the pairs. That would be another common one. So there's some pretty obvious hands where it's like, okay, we would never fold any pairs in our big blind situation. So our opponents will know, okay, well, they have 100% threes, 100% fours, maybe not 100% tens because maybe we're three betting, et cetera. But yeah, I mean, how common is it from your perspective that just players at small stakes aren't aware of the range advantage and the nut advantage?
In smaller games, I'm assuming most players are not particularly aware of this. Like
What
very
about
small
with like
percentage.
Yeah, like red chippers and your students and things like that?
That's a much higher percentage, but even still, it's not 100% by any stretch of the imagination. It's just if so. When people get into studying, it really seems like they either take like the exploitative tact or they take the GTO tact. And the people that go the exploitative route tend to miss a lot of this stuff because they're just so focused on the hand reading stuff and trying to figure out how to apply pressure to the range that they assign. And they try to make sure they have some bluffs in their range, but at the end of the day, it's largely about like, okay, where are the kinks in my opponent's ranges and their strategy as a whole, and how can I just apply pressure? Mm-hmm. And the people that go more the GTO route are obviously more focused on playing their range as opposed to their hand against their opponent's range. And I think they become more cognizant of things like nut advantage and range advantage and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's good context. So I think one of the most important parts of deceptive value, and I would say mathematically provable deceptive value, is the plausibility of you employing the strategy. Right. So what James is talking about is like when we look at these, range advantages and nut advantages, what is the plausibility that you would have value raising hands on this board, right? So we just talked about a 10-4-3 board. Well, we can have the sets. We can have 4-3. We can have top pair. We probably can't have too many overpairs. So that's something to be aware of. So our opponent can actually have jacks plus and all those hands. And we really can't. So that would be, I would say, a slight maybe not slight, but like a pretty good range advantage towards our opponent. However, we do have some of the nut advantages. So this is a situation that's maybe a little bit mixed, where it's like there's some variables that like, okay, we could definitely have some very strong hands, and then some variables that say, well, on average, maybe our opponents have some stronger hands. So this is what I would say is like an okay situation, where it's like, going back to our football analogy, it's like an okay situation to run. It's like not like the ideal situation. It's not like 3rd and 1 or 2nd and 1 where we just want to pick up a couple of yards. But it's like, it's pretty good. 2nd and 10, 1st and 10, whatever. Like, you could run the ball. No big deal. So with all that in mind, what percentage, like that, James' original question is, what percentage do we raise this board? And basically it would be, well, just do it, I don't know, 10% or 20%. Right? Like you actually don't have to get too complicated. And, if I'm just like looking at my hand, like Jack 10 suited or 10-9 suited towards the lower end of my kickers, I'd say, okay. So what are the hands I can have here? So I should know my pre-flop range. I can start analyzing myself a little bit here and just kind of go with it and go, okay, do I have ace 10 suited? Well, maybe ace 10 suited, I'm 3-betting. Maybe Jack 10 suited, but I'm 3-betting. So then I'll have queen 10, king 10, 10-9, 10-8, 10-7. I think 10-6 as well, probably. Actually, maybe I think 10-6 maybe starts to be a 3-bet for me. So anyways, I can figure out my range, go into whatever range I'm using at that moment and start analyzing, okay, now out of these combinations, say we have 9 combinations. Is there any combinations I want to raise and others I want to avoid? For example, I think 10-6, let's say we had 10-6, kind of appealing as a call here because you're going to have some backdoor 5s that give us really easy calls, but also give our opponent some potentially appealing looking bluffs, or with like things like aces and things like that. So there's like that type of thing. So, just trying to account for the various scenarios, and you're really just trying to analyze as much as you can. You will not be able to analyze everything in these situations. That is how GTO works, is that it's so complicated. None of us are able to implement it on the fly. However, you can kind of go through like, okay, I have X amount of, this category of hand, top pair with a flush draw. Let's go through how I would want to handle them. Maybe some are better. So we get up to king 10, we get up to queen 10. We don't have jack 10. We do have 10-9. We say, you know what? All right, I'll just take all of these and I'll raise 15% of the time. And if you're playing online, you can just go click on your Google random number generator that many of you use, or if you're live, you can have a little watch with you and check that. Honestly, that's typically how I do it. Like it just literally is a random frequency, and I do make an assessment of my range on the fly in the moment. And you may feel more comfortable with that or less comfortable with that. It just depends. But for the most part, you're making an approximation, and then you can actually just use a RNG to help you randomize so that you're not the one choosing it and it is objective. And just imagine that, like, imagine you're in the small blind here and you have now bet out with your, middle strength, queen 10 off or something like that for top pair. And your opponent would just goes ahead and tells you, she says, oh, okay. So with top pair and a flush draw, I'm going to raise you 20% of the time. With sets, I'll raise you 80% of the time. And with ace 10, I'm going to raise you 15% of the time. Raise.
Good luck. Yeah.
What do you do?
That's exactly it. But I can already hear like the cringing of people listening to this and being like, how the hell am I supposed to do that? Yeah. Like, how do I even come close to that? And I think therein lies the largest obstacle to this entire thing. Is just like, how? Yeah. Where does that begin? Other than just tons of time in the solver, like where do you start to develop that feel?
Yeah. So let's summarize, I would say. So number one, you have to look at the plausibility of you raising in general. What is the plausibility of a check raise? What is the plausibility of raising for value, right? Because this is a deceptive value play when you're making sort of atypical plays with draws and bluffs, etc. So do you have a plausible raise? We were talking about a hand on the forum this morning where we had been 3-bet very small out of the blinds, and we called with king 9 suited, and the flop came ace king 9. This was an example of a perfect flop that we should never be raising. basically because our opponent, if we start to look at their range, has ace king, aces, kings, they could probably have nines, and basically all the good hands, and we essentially can't have kings plus or ace king. And so our range is just very capped down. So even with a strong hand like two pair, we hit two pair king nine, it's just not plausible. So variable number one, we want to be raising and making these plays in plausible scenarios for our entire range to have these hands.
Good.
Number two, we need to just be aware of the that range advantage and the nut advantage, because those all factor in. Like, you don't want to be putting in raises when you don't have advantages, just because you don't want to be raising when you're behind, right? So if your range on average is behind, we're trying to avoid those on average when we're employing a GTO strategy. And then number three, I would say, is that, like, if you think a decision's close, that's actually a great time to be just having some sort of randomization going on in your game, because by definition, if you're an experienced player or getting experience at this point, and you're unsure, like, you know how to play and you're unsure exactly what to do in this scenario, most of the time it's actually going to be both options are employed a percentage of the time. That's very frequently what you'll find if you actually run these things in the solver. And so in the moment, you can just say to yourself, well, hey, I think I need to call my top pair on the river sometimes. I think I need to fold it, or I think I need to bluff raise my draw sometimes. Just spin the RNG and pick the most conservative randomization you can think of. So it's like, if it's a small percentage bluff, you're like, man, this is a good combo to bluff, but I don't want to bluff here very much. 5%, 10%, done. Right? You're wrong, but, like, you're not that wrong. And if you know that, like, if you're able to, I think most poker players can get a feel of what their two options are. I think in most situations, I mean, pretty much, right?
With time.
Yeah. And if you're wrong on the two options, then you have some real work to do, and that's good. It's actually not even solver work. But yeah, I mean, really, like, you can just say to yourself, is this a close decision? Okay, it's a close decision. Like, over time you will get experience looking in the solver, but really, like, you don't need to be bluffing that often. 20% of the time in most situations for most hand combinations. There's some situations where that won't apply as well. But that's the thing, is, like, again, our goal is average accuracy over time. And if you are the type of person who is getting in and making an appropriate bluff, but only doing it at frequency so you're not over bluffing too badly, like, you'll be going wrong one way or the other. That's okay. Your opponents aren't doing this at all, right? So when they raise you on the river, you're like, oh, that's a value raise. How do I need to respond to a value raise, right? How many situations in small stakes poker do we see people fold, like, kings to the aces and things like that, because it's just so predictable? Like, not even very sophisticated players are just like, well, oh, you just 3-bet shoved it on me on the dry flop. Like, I understand you have a set. I have bottom set. I guess not good poker players. Maybe, folding bottom set's probably never a good play, but it's, other players do become extremely predictable. And so if, like, you just have, like, my flop c-bet got big check raised here, and this is the type of player who could be bluffing, and I just roll an RNG for 5%, and I shove my gut shot. Are you really going that wrong? Now, I understand that's terrifying for the average player, but now look at the reality from your opponent's perspective. Their opponents never bluff here. You just shoved, right? We're not trying to do this all the time, because that would assume exactly how our opponents are going to handle it, which is what we don't want to do. We want to be defensible with our positions and our ideas. But if you're doing it 5%, if you're shoving a gut shot 5% of the flop to a plausible check raise bluff, I mean, you can't go wrong. That's just the definite. It's only happening 5% of the time. And is it sad when you get stacked? Like, yeah, I guess. But you can, even when you get stacked, just have the confidence. It's just like, well, this is like 5%, and he still had to call, and it's like,
what are you gonna do? Yeah.
And how fun is it when you hit?
I think the plausible part is the most important part of this, because that forces you to look at situations and say, is it plausible for me to have a raising range here, and what kind of combos would actually fit in there? Otherwise, if you don't have that, then you're not really even able to identify a spot where raising could make any sort of sense. And then you're never going to be able to figure out the frequency. So understanding what are situations where plausibility makes sense. And honestly, your point earlier is very, very fair. Just essentially look at who can reasonably have the strongest range here. The ace king 9 example is like perfect because we just, as the caller, just really don't do very well at all on that board. So we just know there's not a plausible spot to throw in a tremendous amount of bluffs versus spots that are closer or spots where even advantage is in our favor. Then we know going more aggressive is going to make more sense, and having a higher frequency of aggression is going to make more sense. It's a very simple way of looking at it, but I feel like no one's really talking about that for, well, better or worse, I suppose.
It really, and I think it's because of I think we're even having difficulty discussing it now, is that these concepts are hard to maybe conceptualize and internalize. One of the tools I like actually is imagine your opponents were doing this, right? Imagine you're at your standard live game and you think you know how everyone plays. And then all of a sudden, you play a hand, you get check raised or you get 3-bet shoved on the flop after you check raise. And then you're like, oh crap, like he's got a set. And then you fold. And then the standard taggish player flips over like the gut shot in that situation. And you're just like, excuse me? That, I think, is the best way to internalize it, is that if you are the type of player who is kind of capable of making any type of play in any type of scenario, we hear people talk about that a lot. Oh, he's capable of anything. They're capable of anything, right? That's difficult to play against. It's terrifying to play against. It's scary. And that is the value. That is the value. So if you're able to look at the situation from your opponent's perspective and realize that they are going to have to make decisions, and that if you just add in this random element, there's actually I like competitive StarCraft from time to time, just to watch it. And basically, if you're not familiar with StarCraft, it's just it's a competitive game where there's two sides and then you attack each other. You build up and you attack each other, and you can attack early, you can attack late, and there's sort of an economy that fuels the whole thing. And so what happens is that players realized the same thing, is that if you attack early, well, if it doesn't work, you lose. So it's really the risk is really high. Also, because you've just sort of compromised your economy and someone else has been building up. But if you never attack early, people just optimize for super late, and then they just get an economic advantage ahead of you. So if you attack early 5% of the time or 10% of the time, and there's a whole scale, it's like it can be super early or like kind of early, all of a sudden your opponents, they have to deal with a random element that just can't be accounted for. Like it just can't be. Like, at the end of the day, they have to make suboptimal decisions and handle multiple defenses at the same time. And because they're accounting for two things at the same time, that costs resources, that costs time, that costs money, it costs risk. And that's what we're assessing in poker, is that basically, if you're, imagine your standard live game, you get caught with one of these crazy bluffs, a small percentage of the time, and then it gets shown. And then for the rest of time, your opponents have to deal with the fact that you might have that thing that they didn't think is possible. That's the value. And then, by the way, if you don't ever get caught, then you just got away with it the entire damn time. And that's just free value. That's just 5%. You just got the pot, right? So like, that's kind of like, I think that's the way to internalize it, is that like either like you've created this incredible level of uncertainty and branching in your opponent's defense of how you play, or you're just getting away with it. Like there's no way to actually lose. That's the thing I think that people get confused about, is that it's like they're so scared about showing, losing their stack or whatever in a big pot or making the wrong play. But if you've randomized something, you're not making the wrong play often. You're so protected. Yep. It seems scary, but but it's just not. And what you've actually done is you've created a safer strategy for yourself, because your strategy will never be predictable. It will never be defensible. And especially when you're dealing with like small stakes games where your opponents are less sophisticated, you're actually creating whole new branches of ways for them to make mistakes.
Right, because let's just say that someone sees you flip over that gut shot in that instance and you win the pot and you drag it. They don't know if you're doing that some percentage of the time with gut shots, if you're bluffing a tremendous amount of the time overall. And like the way that they're going to adjust, especially less sophisticated players, is like they're just going to overdo it one way or the other. Right now, all of a sudden, maybe the nits say, okay, well, I'm going to start hero calling you left, right, and center. Well, now you're just printing value and you can start minimizing your bluffs and easy peasy. And they're probably not going to adjust for a very long period of time, readjust after that. So it's one of the most beautiful things in the world when you do get caught, because most players are going to make some sort of adjustment against it, and usually not for the better, at least not for themselves.
Yeah. I think it's extremely frequent. I mean, think how many times in a live game, I'm speaking to the general group here. Think how many times you've been in a spot and you saw someone show down a crazy hand, and then you're just like, crazy person seat one, like, and you just have that mental note for the rest of the session. That's so common.
Yep.
And then, the way live players typically tend to adjust against the quote unquote crazy person is they just start calling wider and calling looser, which is generally the opposite optimization, but that you would want ideally, which is think how fun that is. So now you have people who, if they catch you doing your crazy little strategy, will now over optimize. There's actually this fun little litmus test that you and I talked about where I was talking about how the Vegas regs think about my play. And I was like, I think half of them think I'm like the craziest maniac of all time, and half of them think I'm a nit. And that is, I think that kind of element to your game is a good demonstration that like people will just have the wrong idea, because my game is balanced. That's why they think that. 50% think one way, 50% think the other way, because it's balanced. It's, if you're looking at a live sample size, you're just going to be like wrong one way or the other. And that's the only way that people can think, is in terms of like, oh, he's this or he's that. They can't think, oh, he's just about right. He's just like right in the middle. It's just like, people can't even conceptualize that you might like make different plays with different hands. I think most of the time they just assume that you have a static strategy. And I think most of us do have a static strategy.
Yes.
In many instances. So
yeah. They can't conceptualize it, and they just have no basis for it, because the sample size of how many hands they're seeing you show down is just going to be so small, and they're not going to have a great history on like your overall frequencies, even on something basic like C betting. So yeah, there's just massive amounts of uncertainty for them, and I think that's exactly why some people see you as crazy and others not so much. Kind of a normal guy.
Yep. And I have a classic example that I love, is that I think in general, we tend to underestimate how capable our opponents are. And so there was this game I had been playing in, and just pretty regularly. And there was this, one guy there. I knew he was he was an older guy. I knew he played for money. He never got out. I barely played a pot with him in like a couple dozen hours, like a lot of hands with this guy at the table. Right? He was another good player, and he clearly recognized that I was capable. And, just, I think a standard situation comes up. He raised on the button. I 3-bet him. He decided to call this time, which I think was one of the first times it ever happened. So you're probably thinking to yourself, oh shit, like old man coffee's coming after you, right? Best be careful.
Here's ace king. He's got it.
Yeah. And I forget the exact board, but I want to say basically flop came like monotone, and I had top pair. I randomized off of my watch, checked it to him. He bet the flop, called, trips on the turn, and then he made like an oversized bet on the turn, and to the point, and I think he was basically threatening my whole stack. I was going to have to shove if I was going to play the hand. And so you're just looking at that situation, you're like, old man coffee, monotone board, betting huge, like what does he have? Like it has to be, and I had trips. I guess I had top trips at this point, and I was like, I mean, is he even calling me with ace jack offsuit? The old man coffee in a 3-bet pot against his tough opponent. I was like, probably not. Probably not. It's probably like guaranteed flushes. Like he wouldn't bet trips like this. It's just like that level of certainty of old man coffee. And so I just was like thinking about this situation. It felt really, really close. I also didn't have the monotone, so I just had trips bare. And I'm just sitting there thinking about, I'm like, okay, I know this is really close. Feels 50-50. With old man coffee, it feels 0%. Let's call it 25%. So I rolled the RNG 25%, shove it in. And he like just looks flabbergasted, stares at the board, folds his hand, right?
Yep.
And I think that's what people underestimate, is that you might have in live, I had the best sample size you could ever have on this guy. You know, like how often do you end up playing with like 25 hours with someone? It's just like incredibly rare, unless you just play in the same game all the time, right? But and this is Vegas, I don't, right? So this is just like random this is probably one of the few players I had the largest sample size with. And he made this play that nothing I had ever seen him do in my large sample size had indicated he was capable of doing this. And I just said to myself, well, I don't want to be the person who assumes I know how he plays. I'm going to protect myself. That's what this is. This is your insurance plan. This is your insurance plan against you being wrong. Now, I was probably right that he was leaning in a way, like his overall range. This is not a play that he makes a lot. We know that with the certainty, but he is capable of it.
Sure.
And you can't assume you know what your opponents are capable of. And maybe it was just the day he was, fed up, and young whippersnapper comes in, time to show him up, right?
Yep.
So who knows? And you protect yourself by being able to make these frequency plays. And that's why you need GTO in your game, because you don't know what people are doing. Knowing what people are doing all the time is way too hard. Way too hard.
Yep.
Sometimes in poker, you'll be able to pick someone off and doing something specific. Yes, that's true. It's very fun when it happens. However, if you want to be a professional, if you want to be sophisticated and make money, it's your job to deal with uncertainty. And you probably aren't able to know what everyone is doing at any given time. And therefore, GTO will protect you.
Yeah, I have nothing more to add. I think that's a very, very good explanation of it all. I still lean towards the exploitative side of things, just as it's kind of like my default pull. But as I'm throwing more and more of the GTO study into my own stuff, like I'm seeing it, and it's feeling better, because you just don't have to have perfect sample sizes. You don't have to have massive sample sizes where you understand like this person leans this way in their frequencies, or this person's strategy looks a lot like this. Just like, I'm going to protect myself. And when I get a place where I can deviate, I do. But man, being right and being in a really nice zone for 98% of other spots, it's a really, really nice place to be. And if you're newer to this, if you're interested in it, we're doing lots of stuff over on Redship with this. You can always jump in the Discord as well, like Chris mentioned, redshippoker.com/Discord to jump in and join us. But yeah, I don't know. I'd almost like to have this conversation in the inverse too. Have this conversation talking about it from the exploitative first side of things. And I don't know. I think there's value in having the conversation both ways. But I think we're always going to land back on, no. GTO is tons of fun, and we're where we need to be putting a lot of time and effort. But yeah, I don't know. If you're into it, I think we should do that in the near future. I think that'd be a fun episode.
Yeah. Well, I think we should explore some of the depths of exploitative play. Maybe we could have Weasel on. That would be a fun one, I think.
That would be a fun one. Yes.
Yeah, because he does a very good job. We had it a little. I made him pitch exploitative play as hard as he could to me, and we had a really fun chat. And I think he converted me on quite a few variables. So I think that would be actually real fun.
Interesting. Was his major basis, I'm assuming, player population analysis, and doing it from more of that scale? Okay, yeah, that's what I think.
Large data sets, which I think that's the right way to approach it. So and I think to kind of add to your point a little bit too, like I know that you take an exploitative approach in many situations. However, you have that GTO instinct built into your range. In fact, I think you had it built in maybe earlier than a lot of us because you were able and capable of making these really low frequency bluffs that no one would have put you on, and that capability early on. I mean, I remember you doing it in 2005 where it'd just be like James was showing, you're like, holy, what? Where did that come from? And
that's the difficult part, though. The difficult part isn't necessarily having some shade in your strategy as a whole. It's reining it in. Because you mentioned multiple times, like, just have a frequency, just throw an RNG up there, and it's very easy to start having that shade like 90% or 85% in all spots. So there's a level of discipline there to make sure it doesn't get too far out of control, because otherwise then you just become like the aggro fish, and then all of a sudden you're incredibly easy to beat just for a different strategy person. That's all.
That's why I love the role. Like, if you can protect yourself so much if you just say, okay, this seems like a good bluff, let's shade it, let's make it 50%, let's make it 40%. Like, even just doing that protects you so much. So I love it. So yeah, I like that conversation. Sounds fun. We should definitely do that. Let you guys let us know if you're interested in that.
Yes, please. Excellent. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Chris, for hanging out today, and for you for listening, of course. And if you have any comments or questions, don't hesitate to let us know. redchippoker.com/discord to jump in the conversation. And we'll see you guys back next week with another episode. In the meantime, good luck out there and happy grinding.